All right, Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 through 18. The first question, what are reasons Naomi could have had for not getting along with Ruth and Orpah? Just want to mention four. There are likely many more than that. The first one I want to mention is the cultural gap. There's a cultural gap between Naomi and Ruth and Orpah. Naomi, of course, is an Israelite. Ruth and Orpah are Moabites, and very different in their cultural practices. Perhaps the clothes they wore, the food they ate, the kind of food that they ate, the ways they celebrated their different festivities, their birthdays, their holidays, the way they were different in their culture. And getting along with people across cultural lines, if you've ever tried to do it, can be difficult. They're different from you. They don't have the same values that you do. And that is a gap that would have made it difficult for Ruth and Orpah to get along with Naomi. The second gap that we can find in their relationship would be the gap between their religions. There is not much at all in common between the religion of the Israelites and the religion of the Moabites. And so that would have been a very large gap. Their view of God, or the divine, or the gods, plural, that the Moabites would have had, that would have been very difficult. It would be very hard for them to come and find common ground across the religious gap. That would make it difficult for Ruth and Orpah to get along with Naomi, to be able to find common ground. The third gap we want to mention, we talked about the religious gap. We talked about the cultural gap. The third gap is the generational gap. Even if they were both all Israelites, even if they were all of the same religion and the same culture, it would be difficult for these women of different generations to be able to relate one to another. Of course, we see that still today. There are differences between generations, ways of thinking, things that the value systems between generations are difficult to reconcile often across these generational lines. And so that would be another thing that would make it difficult for Naomi to get along with Ruth and Orpah. The final thing I want to mention is not necessarily a gap, but just the fact that they were taking away. Now, this is a relationship that's often mentioned, the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law relationship. They're taking away her precious little boys from her, the boys that she brought up from their youth, and now they're men. And now when she needs them most, being a widow, now they're going to be with these women. And definitely there's a tension between the affection that was shown to their mother and the affection that was shown to their wives. The fidelity between their mother and the fidelity between their wives. And so they have that tension, which puts them in somewhat of a tug of war for the affection of these men. And so that also, as all mothers and daughters-in-laws know, that also has the potential to bring difficulties and challenges to that relationship. But these four reasons at least would have made it very difficult for Ruth and Orpah to get along with Naomi. Now, even if they were able to cross those three gaps in this relational tension, even if they were able to get along, that's still just, yes, in a polite way, yes, in a cordial manner. We can't get away from each other, so we still have to deal with each other. And maybe you have relationships like that. You've seen relationships like that. The individuals, yes, they can speak, they can be polite. They're not rude to each other. There's no animosity directly, but they don't have really a meaningful, a deep, substantive friendship or relationship. But that is very blatantly not the relationship that Naomi had with these two women. And that's what we're looking at in this study today. In verses 6 through 13, the second question, what phrase does the author of the book use to refer to both of the young ladies? Consistently, the author of the book uses the phrase daughters-in-law. He refers to them as her daughters-in-law. The third question, in the same verses, what word does Naomi use to refer to them? She refers to them as her daughters, as my daughters. He talks to them, not my daughters-in-law, not the wives of my husband, not the widows of my husband, of my sons. She refers to them as her daughters. And that seems to be indicative of the relationship that she had with them. The fourth question, list as many pros as you can think of for Ruth to stay in Moab. Some of them are mentioned directly by Naomi herself. Verse 8 of chapter 1, Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house. This implies that they had mothers who had houses that they could return to. For them to stay here, of course, their husbands are dead, so they couldn't gain income of themselves. So if they stayed here, if she stays here in Moab, she would at least have physical sustenance. She would be able to stay with her mother there in her mother's house. Also, skipping over to verse 11, Naomi says, "Turn again, my daughters-in-law. Why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb that they may be your husbands?" If they stayed there, they might have a much higher chance of being married again and being able to have a husband to care for them, a husband to comfort them, have children of their own to give them significance, unfortunately, in that society when a woman's greatest contribution was a child. And these two primarily are the ones that Naomi mentions. But in addition to this, the other pro of her staying there is just the familiarity of being home. Just the familiarity of her own culture, of being around people she knew, the people she had grown up with. Ruth actually mentioned in verse 15, she says that your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods, also to stay with her religion, the religion that she knew. She knew what it was like to worship the gods of the Moabites, knew what it was like to go to their temples, to bow before their altars. That was familiar to her. She had that pro of staying in Moab. The next question lists as many cons as you can think of Ruth for Ruth to go with Naomi. And of course, the cons are just the opposites of the reasons for the pros for her to stay in Moab. If she goes with Ruth, if Ruth goes with Naomi, then she would have no hope, no sure hope, that is, of having a husband. She would have no sure hope of even having sustenance. She's going with a widow back to a land that would reject even she herself as a Moabite. How could she hope to find financial sustenance? How could she hope to have means to provide for herself? And even if she says she'll rely on Naomi to provide for her because of her inheritance or some other means, Naomi's older than her, and eventually Naomi would die. And what would this widow Moabitess have hope of being able to have to provide for herself, to put food on her table? These are cons. The con of not having the sustenance, the con of not having a husband, and thirdly, the other con that we mentioned of not having her gods, of being in a land where women already could not approach and come close to God in the sanctuary, but far be it that a Gentile and even a Moabite, Deuteronomy 23 verse 3 says that a Moabite and an Ammonite shall not even enter into the congregation of the Lord unto their 10th generation. So she does not even have hope, it seems, of having religious closeness with this God. This is a con for her of going back to Israel with Naomi. Sixth question. How do you think Ruth came to love Naomi so strongly? The love she has for her is evident. There's no denying that. How did she come to love her so strongly? Well, it couldn't have been that she just had an affinity towards her, some unnatural attraction that she had towards this woman, because Orpah seems to have loved Naomi as well. And so why is it that Ruth and Orpah had such a love for their mother-in-law, this woman in a different generation from them, a different culture from them, a different religion from them, this woman who was their mother-in-law? How is it that she came to have such a strong love for her that she was willing to sacrifice her mother's house, willing to sacrifice hope of having a husband, willing to sacrifice her familiarity, willing to sacrifice her religious background and religious practice? How was it that she came to have such a love for this woman? It's not explicitly stated, but I believe it's most reasonable to conclude that it was because she saw Naomi jump across those gaps. She saw Naomi cross the cultural, religious, generational gap. She saw Naomi not have a jealous eye towards her as her mother-in-law. She saw Naomi love her beyond the love of cordiality, beyond the love of politeness. She saw her love her with a love that can only come from God. The love, as John says, is of God, and everyone who loveth is born of God and knows God. That love that she had never experienced, not even in her own mother's house. Her living mother, she was willing to forsake for this, her mother-in-law. She saw a love from Naomi that she had never experienced in her life, and that love was strong enough to bring her, to break all of the ties of familiarity, all of the ties of her past, and bring her to say that your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death should part thee and me. This love was, as someone said in our study when we looked at this last week, someone said, love is love inspired. It was a response to the love that she saw in Naomi that developed in Ruth, this love for Naomi. The last question in applying this, how can we apply this to personal evangelism? We look at this and we see here an amazing experience, amazing relationship that Ruth had and had with Naomi. And we see that that was the strongest power to bring her out of her religion, bring her out of all of the things that were drawing her away from the God of heaven. And by extension, to drawing and attaching herself to Naomi, she's attached to the living God. This is the example of evangelism that we find here, but not only here, but we see this as the example of Jesus. That Jesus did not send out his message from heaven and say, come to me, but it says that it was by love. It was by declaring the Father, by showing us the Father. It was by showing us the love of God and walking among us and doing good and healing the sick and raising the dead and ministering to the needs of people and laying down his very life for these who were enemies to him. It was by this that Jesus did his work of evangelism. And this is the example that we have here in Naomi and Ruth's experience. This is what we all need to be pressing towards. I look at myself and I know I'm very far from this. I don't even have this kind of love for my relatives. I'm not able to draw people to me by this beautiful picture of the love of God that we see demonstrated by Naomi. But this is where we need to be pushing towards. We need to be pushing towards receiving the love of God, seeing the depth of the love of God for us, seeing how willing God is to cross all of the gaps between he and ourselves, and that motivating us to cross all of the gaps that we have between ourselves and our neighbors, between ourselves and our coworkers, between ourselves and our relatives, between ourselves and our enemies, between ourselves and any stranger. Seeing that love that motivate, the love that constrained Christ to go to the cross, that love ought to constrain us to serve him by loving his children, regardless of their backgrounds or their habits or their cultures or their religion, that we should have that same love. And by that love, will love be inspired in them for us and by extension to our God. Hopefully Naomi's example can be an inspiration to us and a guide for us as we seek to show others the love of God.